Hi and welcome back to another Java tutorial, and in today's short tutorial we're going to continue on after the while loops tutorial and talk about for loops. This tutorial will be fairly short since we already covered what iterations are in the other video. For loops are just like while loops, but with a bit more structure. Just like a while loop, it executes code until a certain condition is met, and also like a while loop, it can become an infinite loop if not written correctly. For loops have three parts in their parameter: a variable to be tested and or used, the logical test itself, and finally the update of the variable. The first part is the variable. This is what will be tested and what could be used in the actual code. Next is the logical test, and this is just like with the while loop and just like in an if statement. Finally, you have the update. This is where you update the variable so the for loop doesn't become infinite and so it works properly. For loops, from what you can see, is fairly simple, and when we look at it in Java, you'll see that they're even simpler to use. Let's take a look at a quick example of a for loop. We're going to have a printout of the numbers from 1 to 5 in the output window, and we're going to use a for loop. So the variable would be initialized to 1, then the logical test would be until it reaches 6 or when it's equal to 5, and the variable is incremented after each run. So in the code, we'd have a system out print line, and in the parameter, you would put the variable in the for loop. So taking a look at the example below, for int x equals 1, while x is less than 6, x plus plus, and then system out print line x, and that would print out 1 through 5. The x less than 6 could also be replaced with x less than or equal to 5. So let's go ahead now and turn over to Java and take a look at how they're actually used and compare them with a while loop. Alright, so let's take a look at an example of a for loop and compare it to a while loop. So here, I have a simple while loop with a variable called counter. This is what's going to be our control in the while loop, our test, what we're going to test it against. And in this simple while loop, all we're doing is printing out whatever the counter is, the number with the while loop and the counter. So let's take a look at this line by line. First, we initialize a counter and give it the value of 0. Then, when we write the while loop inside the test here, it's going to run while counter is less than 11. So it's going to run up until counter becomes 10. While this is true, while the test is true, it'll print out the number with a while loop and it'll print out the count variable. And finally, it's going to increment the counter by 1. These two pluses here is an incrementation. It'll increment the number, it'll increment the variable by 1. And then finally, we're going to be incrementing our counter variable. To increment, simply all you have to do is put these two plus signs. That will signify that it'll increment it by 1. You can also decrement it. All you have to do is put two minus signs. But for this case, we're just going to be using the incrementation or two plus signs. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. And as you can see, it prints out the number with a while loop and it prints out from 0 all the way to 10, just like what we expected. Now, as you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4 parts that you have to write. You have to write the variable, write the while loop, you have to write, this is going to be written no matter what, the printout, and then you have to write the incrementation. Let's take a look at a for loop instead and see how they're the same and how actually what we tried to do with the while loop is just as easy with the for loop. I'm going to go ahead and comment out the while loop so that way it doesn't bother us. And now for the for loop, from what you can remember in the PowerPoint, this is the way you start off with the for loop. For the variable, the test, and then the incrementation. Now let's take a look at this one by one and compare it with the while loop. Up here in the while loop, we had an int counter and we gave it the value of 0. This is the same as writing int x equals 0. They're both the same. Next, we have the test, while x is less than 11. And in here we had while counter is less than 11. They're both the same as well. And then finally, we have the update, x plus plus, which is the same as in counter plus plus. So in this one line here, we wrote what we have here, here, and here, all in one line. And then we have the same exact system out print, except it says this is with a for loop and it has x instead of counter. Let's run it and see what happens now. And as you see, the number with a for loop is, again, 0 to 10. So in this case, using a for loop is a lot simpler to use than a while loop if you're trying to repeat something a certain number of times. There are certain cases when you do need to use a while loop over a for loop, in the example that we used before where we had the user input. And the reason being is because a for loop will run until that condition is met. It's structured in that way. Whereas a while loop can run until something else happens. It can run either until that condition is met, where x is less than 11, or it can run until something else happens, if you remember from the last video, when the user clicked on cancel, which returned null. That's a different use for the while loops. Let's take a look actually at what for loops are more widely used for. I'm going to uncomment this section here, and although we haven't covered arrays yet, I'm just going to go ahead and touch on them just a little bit, just for this example. This array here has the values of 12, 33, 5, 10, and 91. Think of an array as a line of boxes put together, and each box can contain a different variable. The box can contain either a string, it can contain an int, or a double. All of that is specified when you create that array. And very simply, you just define what array it is, int, double, or string, you give it a name, and then you give it the values. Or if you're going to be making a new array, you would write something completely different. Now let's take a look at the for loop really quick. It's almost the same. Int x equals 0. X is less than the array's length. This method here returns the length of the array. In this case, it is 5. And then it'll increment this x. And then it'll print out a number in the array, and it prints out whatever is inside that index. So what's inside the first box is inside index 0. The second box is index 1, and then so forth. We'll look at arrays in a much later video. So let's go ahead and run this now and see how this prints out. And as you can see, it prints out 12, 33, 5, 10, and 91, just like it's written here. This concludes today's tutorial. We saw what for loops are and how they're different and similar to while loops. We also took a little look into arrays, and we saw how for loops are used with arrays. We also compared how the while loop is different than the for loop in the sense of the testing. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you next time.